What happens when a shield becomes a target? In the winter of 1969, a specific shade of blue was introduced to the streets of south-central Los Angeles. It wasn't just a color. It was intended as a visual shorthand for a new kind of social contract. The original architects of the Crip identity envisioned an acronym, Community Resources for Independent People. In their view, this was a defensive collective, a paramilitary response to the systemic abandonment of the inner city and the vacuum left by the dismantling of the Black Panther Party. The blue rag was meant to be a uniform of solidarity, a signal that the wearer belonged to a vast, protective brotherhood that could provide the security the state refused to offer. But 50 years later, the sociology of the street has undergone a mutation that the founders never anticipated. Today, in the precincts of Los Angeles, a Crip is statistically more likely to be killed by another Crip than by a member of the rival Bloods. The brand has become the primary mechanism of its own destruction. We are witnessing a systemic collapse where the identity itself has become a bullseye, and the civil war within the Blue Nation has turned the neighborhood into a self-liquidating laboratory of violence. The tragedy of the modern American ghetto is not just the presence of gangs, but the fragmentation of those gangs into hyperlocal cells that no longer recognize a common flag. To understand how a movement meant for independent people turned into a fratricidal machine, we have to look past the headlines and into the mechanics of the blue-on-blue conflict. This is not a war over ideology or territory in the traditional sense. It is a war of the decentralized franchise. It is a conflict where the brand identity, the blue rag, remains, but the corporate headquarters has been demolished. In this vacuum, the Crips have transitioned from a social movement to a disorganized labor pool of crash dummies. Young men who are essentially programmed to perform high-risk, low-reward acts of violence against their own neighbors. In a small corner store on Crenshaw Boulevard, a man in his late 50s wipes down a counter. He has owned this shop for 30 years. He stocks a specific brand of bottled water and a specific type of snack cake, but his most important inventory is his knowledge of the local geography. He knows that if a teenager walks in wearing a Seattle Mariners hat, he is likely from the 60th Street neighborhood Crips. If another walks in with a Texas Rangers hat, he represents the 8 Trey Gangsters. To a tourist, these are just sports logos. To the shopkeeper, they are early warning systems for a kinetic event. He watches the door not for the police, but for the subtle shift in semiotics that precedes a shooting. He is a non-player, a civilian caught in a grid where the rules of engagement change every few blocks, dictated by teenagers who have never left a 10-square-mile radius. The anatomy of a gang territory in the United States is often misunderstood as a cohesive empire. In reality, it is a series of overlapping, often hostile microstates. In South Central, the geography is a grid of numbered streets that act as borders. The neighborhood is not a vague concept. It is a rigid mathematical boundary. When the Crips first formed, these boundaries were porous. There was a sense of Crip crazy or Crip love that unified the various sets against the common enemy of the Bloods. But in 1979, the foundation cracked. The murder of Raymond Washington, the movement's original visionary, left a power vacuum that was never filled. Without a central figure to adjudicate disputes, the internal friction began to heat up. The spark was a conflict between the Rollin' 60s and the 8 Trey Gangster Crips over something as trivial as a personal slight and a stolen car. That single rift, the NHC versus the Gangsters, effectively ended the era of blue unity and inaugurated an era of permanent attrition. This schism created a decentralized glitch. Unlike the Italian-American Mafia, which utilized a commission to resolve disputes and maintain the profitability of the organization, the Crips evolved into a franchise model where any 15-year-old with a firearm can initiate a war that the elders have no power to stop. There is no chairman. There is no board of directors. There is only the set, a group of 20 to 50 individuals who prioritize their street number over the Crip name. This is set tripping, the logic where the hyperlocal supersedes the national. It is a systemic failure of leadership that ensures no peace treaty can ever be permanent, because there is no one authorized to sign it on behalf of the whole. Consider the hat code. In the 1980s, the blue bandana was the primary marker. But as law enforcement began using the bandana as a reason for profiling and gang injunctions, The sets adapted by using professional sports apparel. This was a move of tactical brilliance that eventually turned into a logistical nightmare. A young man in a Cincinnati Reds hat is no longer just a baseball fan. In certain neighborhoods, the C stands for Crips, but in others, the red color marks him as a Blood. More devastatingly, within the Crip world, the Seattle Mariners S identifies a member of the 60s, making him a target for the 8 Trays, who might wear the Texas Rangers T. The sports industry inadvertently provided the uniforms for a civil war. For the civilian living in these zones, getting dressed in the morning is a high-stakes calculation. One does not simply choose a color. One chooses a side in a conflict they didn't ask to join. A young man sits on a concrete porch in the mid-afternoon. He is 19, but his eyes carry the heavy, glazed look of a combat veteran. He is scrolling through a social media feed, looking at disrespect posts from a rival Crip set 3 blocks over. In the old days, a dispute might have been handled with a fistfight or a conversation between respected elders. Now, the insult is digitized and broadcast to thousands. The digital space has accelerated the cycle of violence, removing the cooling-off period that once allowed tempers to settle. He feels the weight of his set's reputation on his shoulders. He knows that if he doesn't respond to the digital slight, he will be labeled a mark or a bitch by his own peers. The pressure to escalate is not coming from a general or a kingpin. It is coming from the collective expectation of a decentralized mob of teenagers. He is a crash dummy, a term used on the streets for those who are sent on missions with a high probability of death or life imprisonment, often for zero financial gain. The blue-on-blue reality is a clinical, mathematical process of neighborhood liquidation. Because the violence is internal, the state's response is often one of managed containment rather than resolution. If 2 Crip sets are busy eliminating each other, the broader societal threat to the affluent suburbs is diminished. The street becomes a self-cleaning oven. The resources that should be going toward community development are instead diverted into the carceral system. Every young man who goes to prison or to the cemetery is a lost unit of economic potential. This is the harsh reality. The gang structure, which was sold as a way to get money and protect the block, has become the most effective tool for keeping the block in a state of permanent poverty and high turnover incarceration. The economics of the modern set are equally fractured. The image of the wealthy, organized drug kingpin from the 1980s has largely been replaced by a scrappy and desperate hustle. With the legalization of marijuana and the shift in the global narcotics trade, the traditional corner is less profitable than it used to be. The younger generation often turns to scamming, identity theft, and low-level robberies to fund their lifestyles. This shift from a structured drug trade to disorganized crime has made the streets even more volatile. In a structured trade, violence is bad for business. It brings heat and interrupts the flow of capital. In the decentralized scamming era, violence is often a matter of personal ego and street credibility, unmoored from any economic logic. Behind the security bars of a local laundromat, a woman in her 60s watches the 19-year-old on the porch. She has lived in this house since 1974. She remembers when the Crips were a neighborhood watch. She remembers the 1992 truce after the riots, a brief, shining moment where it seemed the blue-on-blue violence might finally end. She saw the Bloods and Crips shaking hands on television. But she also saw how that truce was undermined by the lack of economic follow-through. When the jobs didn't come and the investment didn't materialize, the old frustrations returned, and the decentralized nature of the sets caused the truce to crumble from the bottom up. She doesn't see soldiers or gangsters when she looks at the porch. She sees the grandsons of her friends, boys who are being consumed by a system they don't even understand. She keeps her lights low at night and has taught her grandchildren to sleep on the floor, below the window line. This is the collateral lens, the reality that for every player in the game, there are 1,000 non-players who are paying the tax in blood and anxiety. The consequence of this internal war is the total erosion of the community in community resources for independent people. When you cannot trust the person wearing your same color, the social fabric doesn't just tear, it dissolves. The neighborhood Crips, NHC, and the Gangster Crips, ETG, have created a binary that has lasted for over 4 decades. It is a legacy of trauma that is passed down like an inheritance. A boy born on 83rd Street is born into a feud with 60th Street that began before his father was born. He has no choice in the matter. The geography is his destiny. Why is this cycle so impossible to break? The unifying theory of street violence in the United States suggests that it is not a bug in the system, but a feature. The fragmentation of the Crips ensures that there is never a unified front to demand political or economic change. The energy of the youth is directed inward, consumed by the blue-on-blue friction. The system of set tripping creates a perpetual motion machine of grievance. For every hit, there must be a get-back. For every get-back, there is a new generation of orphans and grieving mothers who harbor a resentment that fuels the next 20 years of conflict. It is a closed loop. The tragedy is that the Crip identity was born out of a desire for agency. It was an attempt by a marginalized people to create their own structure in a world that offered them none. But without a central ethical core or a stable hierarchy, that structure became a cage. The blue rag, once a symbol of a defiant new world, has become the shroud of the old one. The civil war they are losing is not against an external enemy, but against the very logic of their own organization. As the sun sets over South Central, the orange light reflects off the chain-link fences and the barred windows of the bungalows. The magic hour is the most dangerous time, when the visibility is low enough for a car to pull up unnoticed, but high enough to identify a sports logo from 20 feet away. The shopkeeper locks his door early. The 19-year-old on the porch stands up, adjusting the waistband of his pants, and looks down the street, waiting for a threat that could come from someone who looks exactly like him, speaks exactly like him, and wears the same shade of blue. The blue-on-blue conflict remains a somber reminder that when a movement loses its why, all that remains is the where, the street, the block, the number. And in the end, a street number is a very small thing to die for. If you value these deep sociological dives into the mechanics of the street, consider subscribing to Tales from the Block. The breakdown of the 1992 truce provides the most sobering data point in this investigation. In the wake of the Los Angeles riots, there was a momentary alignment of interests. For a few months, the blue-on-blue violence dipped to historic lows. Men who had spent decades hunting one another were seen sharing meals in neutral territory. This was the false dawn. The failure of that peace was not due to a lack of will among the participants, but due to a lack of structural support from the outside. Peace in a vacuum is unsustainable. Without an injection of capital, without jobs to replace the illicit economy, and without a formal mechanism to mediate the inevitable personal disputes that arise in any high-stress environment, the truce was destined to fail. The decentralized nature of the Crips meant that a peace treaty signed by 10 leaders in a park was not binding for 1,000 teenagers in the alleys. If one 15-year-old from the 83rd Street Gangsters felt slighted by a peer from the 60s, he didn't call a mediator. He pulled a trigger. That single act of defiance could, and did, unravel years of diplomatic effort. It proved that in a decentralized system, the lowest common denominator, the most impulsive member, holds the ultimate veto power over peace. This instability is further calcified by the Prison Street feedback loop. The American carceral system is often marketed as a tool for public safety, but in the context of the Crips Civil War, it acts as an incubator. When a member of a neighborhood set is sent to a high-security facility, he is not removed from the conflict. He is merely transferred to a different theater of operations. In the tier systems of California state prisons, the internal rivalries of the street are magnified. A man from a gangster Crip set might find himself on a yard where his primary threat is not the rival Bloods, but the Rollins sets who share his color. The prison experience forces a hardening of these micro-identities. Survival depends on total adherence to the set's specific ideology. When these men are eventually paroled and returned to the block, they don't bring back a desire for peace. They bring back a refined, more militant version of the set-tripping logic. They have spent years marinating in the grievances of the tier, and they transmit that intensity to the younger generation on the street. The prison system, rather than breaking the cycle, serves as the connective tissue that keeps the blue-on-blue war alive across generations. Inside a small apartment near Slauson Avenue, a mother sits at a kitchen table covered in legal documents. She is 42 years old, and she is a non-player. She has never worn a blue rag, never banged a set, and never held a firearm. Yet, she is a central figure in the logistics of the war. Her eldest son is serving 25 years to life for a shooting involving a rival Crip set. Her youngest son, barely 16, has just been put on by that same set. She is caught in a financial and emotional pincer movement. She spends her weekends in the visiting rooms of rural prisons and her weekdays trying to keep her youngest from meeting the same fate. She pays the invisible tax of the street, the cost of collect calls from prison, the cost of commissary, the cost of a defense attorney who promises the world and delivers a plea deal. She is the one who has to negotiate the geography of the neighborhood just to buy groceries, knowing which gas stations are safe and which are hot. Her life is a constant calculation of risk. She represents the inheritance of grief, the reality that the blue-on-blue war is funded by the labor and the sorrow of women who are trying to hold together families that the street is systematically tearing apart. The geography of the conflict is also a product of urban planning and neglect. The physical layout of South Central, the long, straight boulevards, the narrow residential streets, the dead-end alleys, creates a natural environment for ambush and evasion. In the 1960s and 70s, as the industrial base of Los Angeles was dismantled, these neighborhoods were hollowed out. The factories that once provided stable, middle-class employment for black families closed their doors, leaving behind a vacuum. The gangs stepped into that void not just as social groups, but as economic entities. But because they were operating outside the law, they couldn't use the courts to settle business disputes. They used violence. Over time, the business of the gang became less about profit and more about the preservation of the territory itself. The street number became a sacred object. The 60s, the 90s, the 100s, these are not just addresses. They are the borders of mini republics. The tragedy of the blue-on-blue war is that these young men are fighting to the death over property that they do not own, in neighborhoods that are being systematically devalued by the very violence they perpetrate. This leads us to the digital frontline. In the era of the smartphone, the war has moved from the walls to the cloud. Historically, a gang would tag a wall to mark its territory. This was a slow, physical process that could be painted over by the city or a rival. Today, a disrespect video on a social media platform is permanent and global. A member of an 8-tray set can film himself mocking a fallen member of a neighborhood set and upload it instantly. The comment section becomes a digital war zone where the tension is ramped up in real time. This digital escalation removes the friction of distance. In the past, you had to physically go to a rival's territory to provoke them. Now, you can do it from your bedroom. This has led to a phenomenon of reactive violence, where shootings occur not because of a planned territorial expansion, but as an immediate, impulsive response to a digital slight. The speed of the internet has outpaced the ability of the community to intervene. By the time an elder or a mother hears about a dispute, the crash dummy is already on his way to the mission. The unifying theory of this catastrophe is the concept of social attrition. If an external force, the police, the government, or a rival ethnic group, were killing Crip members at the rate they are killing each other, it would be labeled a genocide. There would be international outrage and massive political mobilization. But because the violence is internal, it is often dismissed as senseless or gang-related, labels that serve to dehumanize the victims and absolve the state of responsibility. This internal liquidation is the ultimate victory for a system that views these young men as surplus labor. As long as the blue-on-blue war continues, the energy that could be used for political organizing, for economic development, or for demanding systemic change is instead consumed by the friction of the block. The Crips are not just losing a war. They are performing a slow-motion act of collective suicide. The final stage of this evolution is the post-gang era. We are starting to see sets that no longer even bother with the Crip name, identifying only by their street or their specific clique. The nation is dead. Only the tribe remains. This hyperfragmentation makes the neighborhood even more dangerous for the civilian. In the old days, there were rules. You didn't shoot at houses with children. You didn't work near schools. There was a modicum of respect for the elderly. Those rules were enforced by a hierarchy that no longer exists. Today's crash dummy is unmoored from any tradition. He is a freelance agent of chaos, motivated by a desperate need for clout in a world that offers him no other path to significance. He is the end product of 50 years of systemic abandonment and internal betrayal. As we look at the map of South Central, we see a patchwork of blue. But that blue is not a monolith. It is a mosaic of shards, each one sharp, each one capable of cutting the other. The tragedy of the Crips is the tragedy of a vision gone wrong. A movement that started with the promise of community resources has ended in a cycle of community depletion. The blue-on-blue war is a clinical example of how a marginalized group can be manipulated into destroying itself, one block at a time, one set at a time, until there is nothing left but the silence of the cemetery and the echoing grief of the non-players. The street does not remember the names of the soldiers for long. Their names are spray-painted on a wall, then washed away by the rain or covered by a new tag from a new generation of 15-year-olds who think they are the first to discover the blue rag. The only thing that remains is the system itself, the prisons, the courtrooms, and the funeral homes, all of which continue to thrive on the steady supply of young men who believe that their street number was worth more than their life. If you are compelled by this clinical look into the structural collapse of the streets, consider joining the community at Tales from the Block by subscribing for more deep dive investigations. The economic tax of the street is not merely a metaphor. It is a literal transfer of wealth from the poorest neighborhoods to the most robust sectors of the American bureaucracy. To understand the blue-on-blue conflict, we must follow the money, and that money leads directly to the carceral industrial complex. In the 1980s, the crack cocaine epidemic provided a high-margin, albeit volatile, revenue stream for Crip sets. This capital allowed for the purchase of high-grade weaponry and the funding of defense funds. Today, that revenue stream has evaporated. The decentralization of the drug trade, moving from the street corner to the encrypted messaging app and the dark web, has left the traditional street set in a state of economic desperation. Without a central board of directors to manage the brand, the modern set has pivoted to a predatory economic model that targets its own community. This is the era of the internal parasite. When a set can no longer generate significant income from external drug sales, it begins to tax the local ecosystem. This manifests as extortion of mom-and-pop businesses, organized retail theft within their own zip codes, and the aggressive scamming of elderly neighbors through identity theft. The blue identity, which was supposed to be a shield for the community, has become the license for its exploitation. The younger generation of crash dummies is often functionally illiterate in the traditional economy but highly skilled in the logistics of the play. They are experts in the digital bypass, the credit card clone, and the unemployment insurance fraud. Yet this wealth is fleeting. It is spent on depreciating assets, high-end clothing, rental cars, and jewelry, designed to project an image of success in a digital space that demands constant flexing. The capital never stays in the neighborhood. It flows out to the luxury brands, the landlords, and eventually to the bail bondsmen. Image showing the territorial geography and fragmentation of neighborhood versus gangster Crip sets in South Central LA. The physical manifestation of this economic drain is visible in the landscape of South Central. For every 3 blocks of residential housing, there is a cluster of predatory financial services, check cashing joints, pawn shops, and We Buy Gold outlets. These businesses thrive on the instability of the blue-on-blue war. They are the scavengers of the conflict, providing high-interest liquidity to families who are constantly in crisis mode. When a son is arrested, the family must liquidate their assets to pay for his defense. When a son is killed, the family must crowdfund for the funeral. The gang conflict acts as a centrifuge, spinning wealth out of the hands of the residents and into the hands of those who profit from the fallout. In a small, dimly lit office on Vermont Avenue, a funeral director reviews his books. He is a non-player, but his business is the only one in the neighborhood that is recession-proof. He has seen the fashion of the blue-on-blue war change over the decades, from the tailored suits of the early 70s to the oversized jerseys of the 90s, to the skinny streetwear of the 2020s. But the underlying reality is the same. The bodies are getting younger. He notes the specific tags left in the guest book by the rival sets, a silent continuation of the war within the chapel walls. He is part of the collateral economy, a network of service providers whose livelihoods are tied to the steady cadence of the get-back. He doesn't celebrate the violence, but he is structurally dependent on it. This is the ultimate harsh reality. The ghetto has been engineered to be a high-turnover zone, where the primary export is trauma and the primary import is corrective supervision. The decentralization glitch has also fundamentally altered the nature of leadership within the Crip nation. In the 1970s, a general or an OG, original gangster, held significant sway because he controlled the access to resources and the connections to higher-level suppliers. Today, a 17-year-old with 50,000 followers on a social media platform has more influence than a 50-year-old who spent 20 years in Pelican Bay. The old guard has been marginalized by the algorithmic guard. The elders, who might have the wisdom to call for a ceasefire, are viewed as dinosaurs or washed up. The crash dummy doesn't need the elders' permission to start a war. He only needs a viral reason. This generational disconnect has created a state of permanent revolution within the sets, where the leadership is constantly being toppled by younger, more reckless factions seeking to make a name for themselves. The result is a clinical attrition that serves the interests of urban renewal or gentrification. In cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Chicago, the blue-on-blue violence provides the necessary downward pressure on property values. It keeps the respectable middle class away, allowing for the strategic accumulation of land by developers. When the violence reaches a certain saturation point, the state intervenes not with social programs, but with cleansing operations, mass indictments, and gang injunctions that clear the way for new construction. The young men fighting over the trays or the 60s are essentially acting as the unpaid demolition crew for their own neighborhoods. They make the area so uninhabitable that the residents eventually flee, selling their family homes for a fraction of their potential value to investors who wait patiently for the clearing to be finished. This is the unifying theory of the modern American ghetto. The gang is not an alternative to the system, it is a subsidiary of it. The blue-on-blue war is the mechanism by which the most at-risk population is kept in a state of perpetual high risk. The logic of the set is the logic of the cell. It is a small, isolated unit that is easily monitored, easily infiltrated, and easily destroyed. The Crip name is a brand that has been co-opted by the carceral state to justify its own expansion. Every blue rag seen on a police body cam is a data point used to secure more funding for surveillance technology, more armored vehicles, and more legislative power. As we move deeper into the 2020s, the blue-on-blue conflict is entering its most clinical phase. The violence is becoming more targeted and less visible to the outside world. It is a quiet war of precision hits and digital assassinations. But for the people on the ground, the impact is louder than ever. The non-players continue to shrink their worlds, moving in smaller and smaller circles to avoid the hot spots. The shopkeeper on Crenshaw, the mother on Slauson, the funeral director on Vermont. They are the true historians of the block. They know that the civil war the Crips are losing is not just a war of bullets. It is a war of time, energy, and human potential. The Blue Nation was supposed to be a response to a hostile world. But when the world is no longer interested in your survival, the only thing left to do is to turn on each other. The blue-on-blue war is the final, tragic expression of a people who have been told, for half a century, that they are independent, but have never been given the resources to be anything other than expendable. The sun has fully set now. The blue light of the police cruisers mingles with the blue glow of the smartphones on the porches. Somewhere, a 14-year-old is putting on a specific sports hat, preparing to step out into a geography that has already decided his future. He doesn't know that he is a crash dummy. He thinks he is a soldier. He doesn't know that the war he is fighting has already been lost, and that the only victory available to him is a shorter sentence or a more liked memorial post. Reflecting on this clinical liquidation, we are forced to ask, At what point does a community realize that its greatest enemy is the very thing it created for protection? The story of the Crips is a warning to every social movement that prizes identity over infrastructure. Without a central moral authority, identity is just a uniform for an endless, uncoordinated war of attrition. If you are looking for more than just headlines and want to understand the systemic forces that shape the American street, then subscribe to Tales from the Block. We analyze the mechanics so you can see the truth. The blue-on-blue conflict has an often overlooked logistical hub, the Level 1 Trauma Center. In the geography of South Central, the hospital is not just a place of healing. It is a neutral zone that is constantly under threat of becoming a secondary battlefield. The trauma desert of the inner city means that when a shooting occurs between the 60s and the 8 trays, the victims are funneled into the same narrow corridors of the same emergency rooms. This creates a biological theater of war. Nurses and surgeons become the unwilling witnesses to the blue-on-blue attrition. They see the same families year after year, first for a non-fatal leg wound, then for a spinal cord injury, and finally for the morgue. This is the biopolitics of the block. The state tracks these incidents not as a public health crisis, but as a series of criminal data points. The medical cost of this internal war is staggering, yet it is a cost borne almost entirely by public funds and the overextended spirit of healthcare workers who live in a state of permanent triage. A surgeon stands over a gurney in the early hours of a Saturday morning. The young man on the table has a 60 tattooed on his forearm. Outside the double doors, the waiting room is a pressurized chamber. There are members of the young man's set, and there are members of the set that shot him, both lurking in the parking lot, waiting for news. The surgeon doesn't see a gangster. He sees a shattered femur and a perforated lung. He sees a human body that has been treated as a disposal unit for lead. This surgeon is a non-player who has become an expert in the specific ballistics of street-level warfare. He knows the difference between a wound from a 9mm handgun and the devastating cavitation caused by a rifle round. He is a mechanic in a factory of broken men. When the surgery is over, he will go home, but the blue-on-blue war will continue to supply his next shift. This is the industrialization of injury, a system where the violence is so consistent that it has its own dedicated economy within the medical establishment. The state's role in this decentralization is not passive. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the war on drugs and the subsequent gang injunctions were designed to decapitate the leadership of the Crips. The theory was simple: remove the head and the body will die. However, the sociological reality was the opposite. By targeting the older, more stable members of the sets, those who had the social capital to maintain order and mediate disputes, the state inadvertently triggered a Cambrian explosion of hyperlocal aggressive cells. When you remove the elders who understand the value of peace, you are left with a vacuum that is filled by the most violent and least experienced members of the set. These new jacks had no memory of the original social mission. They only knew the blue identity as a brand of aggression. The legislation that was meant to end the gangs actually democratized the violence, making it more unpredictable and harder to stop. This created the injunction glitch. A gang injunction is a civil court order that prohibits alleged gang members from engaging in otherwise legal activities, like standing on a corner or carrying a cell phone, within a specific safety zone. While this may provide temporary relief for a specific street, it forces the conflict into the shadows and onto the digital plane. It doesn't stop the blue-on-blue war, it just makes it more covert. It also creates a legal lock-in. Once a young man is served with an injunction, he is effectively a permanent target for law enforcement. His ability to find legitimate work is severely curtailed, making him more dependent on the set for survival. The state, in its attempt to clean up the neighborhood, often ends up subsidizing the very recruitment pool that keeps the conflict alive. Inside a cramped classroom at a local community center, a man in his late 50s attempts to lead a conflict resolution workshop. He is a former member of the Slauson sets who retired decades ago. He is a non-player now, but his past gives him a fragile authority. He looks out at a group of 16-year-olds who are staring at their phones. He talks about the blue vision of 1969. He talks about the Panthers. He talks about the waste of human life. but he is speaking a language they don't understand. To these boys, the 60s or the Trays are not a political movement. They are a tribe. Their reality is a constant stream of disrespect, videos, and the immediate pressure of the block. The man realizes that he is a relic. The blue-on-blue war has moved past the point where talk is an effective currency. The decentralization has reached a stage where there is no high command to negotiate with. He is trying to stop a flood with a paper cup. This is the generational fracture, the moment when the oral history of a movement is severed, leaving behind only the mechanics of the feud. The exit paradox is the most terrifying aspect of the modern set. In the 1970s, it was possible to phase out of the lifestyle as you got older. You could get a job, start a family, and while you might always be from the set, you weren't in the game. Today, the digital footprint makes exiting nearly impossible. Your face is in the videos. Your name is in the comments. Your set identity is indexed by both the police and your rivals. If a neighborhood Crip moves to another city to start a new life, his digital past follows him. A rival from the Gangster side can find him on social media and alert local enemies to his presence. There is no deflagging in the digital age. This creates a state of permanent mobilization, where even those who want to leave are forced to stay strapped and active just to survive. The blue-on-blue war doesn't end when you leave the block. It ends when you leave the world. This leads us to the self-liquidating laboratory. When we look at the statistics of South Central over the last 50 years, we see a clear trend. The violence is not random. It is cyclical. It is a closed-loop system that converts human potential into carceral data and funeral expenses. The Crips have transitioned from a social movement to a disorganized labor pool of crash dummies who are essentially self-liquidating. They are cleaning out the neighborhood for the next phase of urban development without the state having to lift a finger. The blue-on-blue conflict is the final stage of a systemic collapse where the identity itself has become a trap. The blue rag is no longer a shield. It is a death warrant signed by a peer. The unifying theory of the blue-on-blue war is that it is a conflict without a victory condition. In a traditional war, one side wins and the other loses. In the decentralized war of the Crips, there is no win. If the 8 Trays wipe out the Roland 60s, they don't gain territory or wealth. They just gain more heat from the police and a new generation of rivals seeking get back. It is a war of pure attrition, where the only thing being won is a temporary reprieve from the inevitable. The system is designed to keep the conflict at a simmer, just violent enough to justify the police budget and the prison expansion, but not so violent that it triggers a massive federal intervention that might actually change the underlying economic conditions. The final harsh reality is that the blue-on-blue war is a form of unpaid labor. The young men who participate in it are providing a service to the status quo. They are managing their own containment. They are policing their own boundaries. They are ensuring that the block remains a zone of permanent instability, which prevents any form of collective bargaining or political power from emerging. The tragedy of the blue identity is that it has become the most effective tool for the suppression of the very people it was meant to empower. As the camera pulls back from the grid of South Central, the streetlights flicker on. From this height, the boundaries between the sets are invisible. The 60s, the 90s, the Trays, they all disappear into a single, glowing map of an American city. But down on the pavement, those lines are as real as concrete. They are the fault lines of a civil war that has no end in sight. The blue-on-blue war is a reminder that when a community is denied the resources for independent people, it will eventually find a way to use those same people as resources for its own destruction. The story of the Crips is not just a story of gangs. It is a story of what happens to the human spirit when it is trapped in a decentralized machine of its own making. It is a story of a shield that became a target and a nation that became its own executioner. If you are looking for a deeper understanding of the systemic forces that shape the American landscape, join us for the next investigation. Subscribe to Tales from the Block.